Hey everyone, today I get to talk to Tibor Shanto. Tibor is the principal of Renbor Sales Solutions. He's been a sales leader for over 25 years, helping companies achieve and improve their revenue goals. Tibor has been called a brilliant sales tactician, working with B2B sales organizations of all sizes to improve those critical aspects of their sales cycle. He's helped shorten sales cycles, increase close ratios, and create double-digit growth through the execution of their strategy, with a focus on tactical execution supported by metrics and the follow-through action plan created by Renbor Sales Solutions. Tibor has also co-authored the award-winning book called Shift, Harness the Trigger Events That Turn Prospects into Customers. Forbes.com in 2014 ranked Tibor as 8th on the top 30 social salespeople in the world. He received a gold medal for top sales and marketing blog in 2013, top sales awards and contributor to the Globe and Mail report on small business, Salesforce.com, Office Technology Magazine, the Huffington Post, Today's Trucking, and has appeared on Business Network News, CHCH TV, and many others. And now he is with us. Thank you, Tibor, for joining me today. How are you?
I'm doing great, Phil. How are you?
I'm awesome. I'm so honored that you're here, my friend. I have followed your work for a very long time, and it is fun to be able to share you with my audience because even though I know that you're amazing, I don't know that my audience knows as much about you as I do. And I've, truly really enjoyed your work. Even though we've only recently kind of formally connected, I've seen your name around all the salespeople that I respect and love. So, Tibor, what was your first sales job? How did you get into sales?
My first sales job was during high school. I was one of those kids who would phone you in the evening trying to get you to subscribe to, in my case, the Toronto Star, which is the big daily here in Toronto. But I'm sure that that's been relived in towns everywhere with their local newspaper. Formally, I got into sales, I would say, in the early 80s, and I'm sure I'm not the first to tell you a tale like this, but probably quite by accident. I was doing something entirely different, and somebody had given me a stock tip, and the stock tip turned out good. I made some money in a relatively short time. Now I know it was highly speculative and gambling in nature, but at the time, it was my introduction to the world of high finance or low finance, depending how you look at it. And so, I felt good. I invested a few $100s, walked away with considerably more. And then the same individual gave me a tip, and I had the entire opposite experience. So I said, there's got to be more to this than meets the eye. And through that, I got introduced to the formalities of the securities industries. And one of the things I found out that in order to get our license up here, you had to go through a formal program, much like in the States. But to go into the program, you had to be sponsored by a member firm. So I had to get a job as a member firm. And of course, the only entry-level job, especially for those people who were getting their licenses, had to do with sales. And that's how I got sucked into the vortex.
So you were a stockbroker?
At one time, yes. An aspiring stockbroker. I'm not sure I ever got to the point where I could look you in the eye and say I am, but I could look you in the eye and say I'm one in training.
Oh, Tibor, you probably don't know this, but that was one of my first jobs too, is I got my Series 7 and 63 here in the States. I had a member firm that sponsored me, like you said, and I had to take my 7 and 63. They were the hardest tests I think I've ever taken in my entire life. So that's really interesting that was your one of your early roles as well. That's so funny.
Yeah, so then from there, you get one role after the other. And I got into, so initially it was around the financial area, and then probably back around the early 90s, just before the internet. So, people who are millennials will have to cast their mind back to a world before the internet. I got a job with one of the Canadian papers, you mentioned it in your intro, the Globe and Mail. And I was on their electronic side. And a piece of trivia, the Globe and Mail was the first newspaper in the world to be online, going back to 1977. It was green screen at the time, wasn't very graphic, but is the oldest archive online from a newspaper. There are other archives, but so anyway, there I was responsible for a group that puts out the ROB 1000, which is similar to the Fortune 1000. And, one job led to another, and I ended up at Dow Jones as a result of that. And then when I left Dow Jones in 2004, or one can argue when Dow Jones left me, in 2004 or so, I was at that fork in the road. What do you do? And I decided to take some of the things that I'd come to learn and know and started my own business, Renbor, as you introduced it earlier.
So Renbor, I'm going to guess, that's part of a take on your name, but what's the Ren part?
My wife's name is Renee.
Ah.
So Renbor. Sometimes when I make calls and they say, Tibor from Renbor, I go, yeah, I guess which part came from me.
Yeah, even I can figure that one out, Tibor. I'm not real smart, but I got that one done.
So Renbor, Tibor. So we have another company called McShant because that mixes up our surnames. So
very cool. That's really cool.
You got to entertain yourself somehow.
Well, see, with a last name like Gerbishak, I think that's entertaining enough. If I did, yours is much more interesting than mine. So Gerbishak is just very Polish, and I don't think all that interesting to anybody but my family, probably.
Well, no, originally it's Hungarian, so we're pretty close,
Oh, okay. Very cool. Very, very cool. So
I was born there, in fact.
Really? Oh, that's neat. When did you come over?
Over is we took an indirect route. We left there in '63 and went to Israel. And then in '68, we left Israel to go to Montreal and then eventually down the highway to Toronto.
Interesting. That's cool. I didn't know that. That's fascinating. So my family migrated over, let's see, sometime in the early 1900s, all German, all the way back, or all Polish. I mean, my uncle my great uncle, so my grandmother's uncle, I believe, or her brother was in Kaiser Wilhelm's army many, many years ago. So that's interesting. So, yep. And believe it or not, Gerbishak is actually anglicized. It was much worse spelling before.
I don't want to take up the time of your audience, but so is Shanto. Shanto is not the original form, but one day we'll get into that.
Yeah, no, I think it's good to give folks a little background so they understand who you are and why you do what you do. So talk to me about this whole social selling thing, Tibor. I'm passionate about it, like I think like many of us are. But tell me, what does it mean to you? What is social selling?
I sort of have a love-hate relationship with it, I'll be honest with you. I remember at the time when I made that list that was published in Forbes.com, on the one hand, you're very flattered and very pleased, but on the other hand, I've always had this personal campaign. I guess we can't say it now. I could have said it last year. We had a personal jihad against, hyphenated sales, right? So I've always, selling is selling, and much like music, it comes in two forms. It's either good or bad, right? Everything else is sort of a marketing spin on that. So I think it is important, and I think the reason that I made that list was less what I say about social selling and more the way that they explained it to me was the evidence of how I use it to promote my business and what I do and so on. So I think it's important. So let me state that up front. I think if you're not using social selling, you might as well shoot yourself in the foot. On the other hand, I've always had an issue with hyphenated selling. I own the URL on hyphenate sales. And let's just focus on selling. So I've always believed in the ever-expanding toolkit. So I'm not a believer in some of these people who put a stake in the ground around one type of selling and then stick and defend it to the end. But I think, selling, like life evolves and you add things, you take away things and so on. So I think social selling currently is a key, but it's not the end all and be all. It's part of a broader toolkit. And I think that the people who've been best at it, and I'm not talking about the people who beat the drums and so on, but, again, looking at results are the ones who figure out how to integrate all the tools that are available now with the tools that have consistently worked. I think one of the risks of sort of isolating whether it's social selling, let's look at an example. Remember Sales 2.0?
Of course.
I sort of poked fun at that because I said if Sales 2.0 is now, then what was it before we had the internet? It was like the Sales 1.0, and And then before we had the fax, was that like sales zero? And then when we had voicemail replacing answering services, was that sales, minus one? So salespeople have always adopted the latest tools, at least the smart ones, to make themselves more efficient, to serve their customers more effectively, to get results for their company, which is ultimately what our role is, to satisfy those two constituencies. So I think using the latest tools is important, but I think those people who are out there advocating, saying certain things are dead and certain things are passe, are not doing their audiences a lot of favors.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think that it is important to, if we steal Tony Hughes' word, right, combo selling, right? It's
Right.
I would say it's a blender of sales instead of a hyphenation of sales, where you take whatever tool you have and you do your best to put that to good use.
Right. So I think the good thing about social selling is that it does continue to help salespeople engage with their prospects where their prospects feel best. So I think just like I can't force a prospect to abandon their preference for the phone or their preference for, LinkedIn or whatever the case is, this allows me to communicate and engage with my customers where they feel comfortable. And if I can make them feel comfortable, it drives engagement, and ultimately, that gets us on the way to having a commercial relationship. I mean, I don't expect to be invited to their kid's bar mitzvah, but I expect to be invited when they need help from a sales point of view.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's important, right? We have to meet them where they are, regardless of whether or not that's comfortable for us. Because I know, many are like, I don't know about these new tools, but I'm going to wade in anyway. And I think that's what makes a successful salesperson, is someone who's willing to do whatever it takes to work with their clients, to meet them where they are, even if it's not where they are.
And I think that's the potential slippery slope, and I emphasize potential, is that I'm seeing a lot of people who are new to sales. So notice I didn't say young, because I don't want this to be a millennial versus non-millennial, but people who are new to sales. And I'll be the first to admit, I advocate for cold calling. I always say cold calling is not dead, it just smells funny these days. So I advocate for cold calling, but it's, again, one of a number of things that you have to do. But what I find is people who jump into the deep end of any hyphenated sales, social selling, sales 2.0, and from what I'm reading, 3.0 is just around the corner. It then prevents them from doing other things. So I met with a company probably the first week of February, and their concern was, as while their people have really adopted well to using social tools like LinkedIn and other things to get to know their customers, and they bought into the whole account-based marketing and selling and so on. What they've also noticed is that their people now, are more reluctant to pick up the phone because they've drank the Kool-Aid that people don't use the phone. And the other is that they also are not optimizing their time because they're spending a lot of time doing research that ultimately isn't necessarily going to pay off. And so, again, balance is the key, as opposed to jumping into the deep end on cold calling or jumping into the deep end on any of the alternative things.
Yeah. So how much research is enough research, Tibor? How do we know when we have enough information about our client that we can stop the research and pick up the phone or send that email?
So I think the question becomes contextual. So you need research, but it's how much do you need to get done what? And let me give you a parallel that maybe people can relate to. So, if you're going to pick up the phone, or if you're going to use email, or you're going to reach out to somebody through LinkedIn or whatever the case is, clearly what you want in that first iteration or first step is to engage with them, right? And that engagement eventually will lead to a sales conversation. When I say eventually, not years, we're talking days, right? So I am a hunter by nature. So to get that initial appointment, I don't think you need as much information as most people think they do. So they use research as a means of an excuse, not necessarily not to pick up the phone, but I want to know everything there is to know about this person. Where if you think about it, and I tell people to take this mantle on, when I pick up the phone and call you and it's an unscheduled call, it doesn't matter what I think, I'm interrupting your day. And that's the core dynamic that's going to drive that first call. It's not my knowledge of your company. It's going to be the fact that I'm interrupting you, and I've got to rationalize to you why you should stay on the phone with me and continue that conversation instead of going back to work, which is the part that most people don't like about the phone. So I think what happens is people do a lot of research, and 70% of their calls are going to go into voicemail. So what good did that research do? B, so it wasn't a good use of time, right? B, even if you get the person on the phone, there's only one singular purpose for that, and that's to get the opportunity to get them to agree that they'll have a further conversation with you, whether that's through the medium that you and I are doing now, face to face, whatever the case is. But they have to agree to, you know what, I'll give you X number of time to listen to your story. To get that, you don't need to know that much. And what tends to happen, and this is human nature, it's not a flaw, you do all this research, you want to show people that you did all this work, right? So all of a sudden you get somebody on the phone, the decision maker, the influencer, whoever it is that you're targeting, and you want to demonstrate how much knowledge you have about them. So instead of focusing on the singular thing, which is to get them to agree to engage with you, you start throwing back the stuff at them. And I'm not talking about throwing up in the brochure sense, but you want to demonstrate that, hey, I read that quote of yours in the back of, Milk Daily, where you said that milk should be a little bit off-white or something like that. It doesn't really make a difference. Now, the person engages with you and says, yes, I'll have that conversation with you a week tomorrow at 2:00. That's different. You better be ready for that meeting. But I'd rather invest a half hour of research into that meeting than a half hour into a call that's going to go into voicemail. And this is a discussion that I have with a lot of people. Look at it from an economic standpoint. If you're going to call 10 people and get one appointment and you're going to do 20 minutes of research on each of those, that's 2 hours of time. If you can estimate what your time is worth, and not to brag, but I know what my time is worth, and it's worth more than the average bear, I could probably buy an appointment for the cost of what my 2 hours were. So to me, it's not a good use of time or money, and I think it just gets people to spend a lot of energy at the wrong part of the sale. But again, I think once they get that engagement, they're going to have to do research to go in so they can actually have a meaningful conversation with that person. They're going to have to know what the objectives of those companies are and a whole bunch of different things, because my motto is if you're going to go in there, you need to be a subject matter expert. Now, you need to be a subject matter expert on what you're selling, not their company, but to really demonstrate your expertise, you're going to have a good understanding of where they are, where their industry, and so forth. So I think if we would borrow a phrase from the transportation industry, I think research needs to be just in time. And most salespeople tend to do the research all the way up front, and they don't get the payoff that they hope to get. And it's similar with onboarding salespeople. We bring them on and we throw everything, including the kitchen sink, at them the first week, even though most of that stuff is not going to have much utility for them till 3, 4, 5 months down the road. And I think that when you're onboarding, you should train them on what they need to succeed this week. And then if they get past that bridge, train them what they need to succeed then. And if your first salesperson is not going to get their first order, your new salesperson is not going to get an order for 3 months, why spend a week teaching them how to enter an order? They're going to forget by the time they get their first order. So it's a just-in-time approach that I would say to research. Do a lot of research, but make sure you're doing it in the right time so it has the payoff.
That's interesting. So I understand, the limited amount of research, right? Slimming that down, and maybe interrupting with a cold call. But what about if you find someone on LinkedIn, if you find someone on Twitter, you find someone on Facebook? I mean, is that more or less valuable than a phone call, or what do you think?
No, again, people get too hung up on the medium, right? It's communication, right? So one of the things that I talk about, when I work with companies, it's, don't assume that everybody in the world sees the world the way that you do, right? So I like the phones, again, it's probably a nature of my age and my function and so on and so on. Where somebody I'm trying to sell to this afternoon may be more prone to the email, right? So I think that my comment is more about what the content of your communication is as opposed to the method of communication. So I've gotten decent deals through LinkedIn where the phone call was very late in the game. I've had people who I've found my way through Twitter and so on. So I think the means, I don't think we should bet on one channel alone. Again, I have a bit of a thing for the phone, but as I say, that's probably more a function of my age, but I wouldn't say this over that. So I think the messaging is the same, and I think maybe that's where some of the changes can be made. And even in the research, I find that some people are researching entirely things that are not going to help them. So Twitter, LinkedIn, phone, that's secondary. It's what are you going to say when you got that person's ears or eyes that I think are going to make a difference.
Gotcha. So starting out by just getting their attention and then deepening that conversation as you can, if you get the
Exactly.
opportunity to go deeper. Okay. Nope, that makes sense. And I'm totally on board with that. And I do like, I agree. The medium is not the message. Maybe it
No.
used to be, right? Hey, Tibor, nice to see you on Twitter. You'd be like, dude, shut the hell up. I've been on Twitter for 5 years, 10 years. Like, shut up.
Yeah.
I don't care, right? That's no longer a conversation starter. But long ago, I mean, that was a big deal. And it isn't
Yeah.
anymore. So I totally agree with that. I think that's solid stuff. So what about salespeople writing content, Tibor? Is that something they should be doing? If you're a B2B salesperson, should you be writing content?
I think that should be driven by the size of the company. I think as you get out there and it is, a brand, if you will, and they have professional marketing resources and things along those lines, I think those companies, my advice to them was always have a coordinated effort, but you can't have every salesperson doing their own content because you want to have a unified voice and so on. Now, you can tailor that to a local or specific audience, and people can do a quick search on what Microsoft did with their social approach and content when it came to their cloud services. So if you do a quick search, there was a whole bunch of articles out there a couple of years ago, and you can see how you can have a central mechanism and system, but at the output end where the rep meets the potential customer, it was very personal, very direct, and so there's that coordinated effort. But the salespeople didn't have to do the content. The content, to borrow a phrase, was curated centrally. Clearly, that's not something that's available as you get down in terms of size and you get into some local smaller companies and so on. Frankly, I think that those of us who are good at writing blogs and so on were forced into it. If we were good authors to begin with, I probably would have been a writer as opposed to a salesperson. But I have a big mouth. I don't worry about grammar. I have opinions, so it sort of seemed to work out for me. But I think some of the local smaller companies I work with, unless the salesperson is the only one who can do that and has the time for that, then I don't think that it should be done by the salespeople. But the salespeople should be the delivery mechanism. They should be aware of what content is being put out there, how it all comes together, and what the overarching plan is. But salespeople should sell.
Okay. So what about video? Should salespeople be playing around with video at all?
Again, I think if it's coordinated, I mean, again, it's a great visual art. I could probably, I was talking to somebody this morning who saw a bunch of my videos and they asked me why I did them. And I said, for a while, I just couldn't be bothered to pick up the pen. So I put a camera in front of my desk and I spoke to it, So I think, again, if there's a coordinated message and they can get that video in front of the right prospect or group of prospects in case of communities and things like that, then definitely, because I think that accelerates the human aspect of it. Now you've got somebody to talk to. I'm sure I'm not the only one, but a lot of us who do use the phone, one of the only reasons I use sometimes LinkedIn, I'll have somebody's name, but I'll bring up their LinkedIn profile so I could look at their picture, and it just humanizes the experience on my side. And if I'm more human, hopefully that carries through on the phone as well. So video, that definitely done right. So again, you don't want some guy sitting there on his, iPhone, doing a video at a red light, trying to prospect for a $100,000 deal. But if they did it as a coordinated effort and was one of the touch points and mediums, then yeah, definitely.
Okay. So I like video as just a quick follow-up thank you to keep that really human. Hey, Tibor, thanks so much for meeting with me today. I just want to say thanks, right? Just 10 seconds, if you need anything, give me a buzz, which I guess that's coordinated, uncoordinated, right? It's kind of unscheduled, but it is part of the process. And I think that's okay.
I think the reason it's good, is, again, as you say, that you had a good meeting with them. It's gonna reinforce all the positive impressions that they took away from you. That's not a marketing type thing. I interpreted your question as being prior to the meeting, before we're unknown entities to each other.
Gotcha.
But even there, a good video with a succinct message that relates to the customer, not your product, not your marketing stuff, but relates to the customer. A good video, could do wonders in an email, right? As opposed to blah, 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 and having these bricks of words there, right? just a human interaction. This is why I want to talk to you. This is what I've done for other people. And, right away, there's that, warmer feeling to the whole thing.
Yeah. Yep. Absolutely. Well, the question wasn't meant to lead you either way. The question was just, kind of follow up there because I guess I hope that I know the difference, but a lot of people might have that question. So I appreciate you clarifying and expanding on that. So, so you said 3.0 is coming. This is news to me, Tibor. What's next, man?
I don't know. I mean, I read a piece the other day. I forget who it was. It might have even been Tony who did a thing on LinkedIn talking about these other people you should follow.
Oh yeah, I saw that. Yeah.
And so I was flattered enough to be part of the list. I know Tony, so I'm not worried about where he's coming from, but I suspect that somebody who shouldn't have access to 3.0 is going to run with it. I find, I don't know what it is, maybe, and this could be a whole other philosophical thing, but I think somehow, the sales industry is envious of IT. And I think partly because there's a lot of IT salespeople. So if you look at a lot of the monikers that sales enablement people tend to use, a lot of them come from IT. And I think it's almost like, put the blank in here, envy, because look at, like, again, you had, Sales 2.0, where did that come from? It came right on the heels of Web 2.0. And if you go back to the original, dot-com boom, you had Business 2.0 was the big magazine, right? So, and then you had the other thing that started popping up a few years ago that I thought was amusing was, sales hacks. Well, where does the word hack come from, right? Like, left on its own, would the sales industry or the sales community ever come up with the word hack? No, it came straight out of the technical areas, right? So if you look at a lot of softwares and a lot of iterations and you look at, where, Web 2.0 went and so on, it's not a surprise that 3.0 is around the corner.
So should we
And
go out and buy that,
the only
Tibor?
good thing to do is to start the 4.0 movement now.
Oh, man, I just went and bought sales3.0.com. Now I got to buy 4.0? Oh, Tibor.
Dude, buy it right up, man, right up to 9. Sales 8.0.
Yeah, like remember what was that on Dodgeball? ESPN the Ocho,
yeah.
right?
The Ocho. That's where my thought came from. Exactly, right. I was gonna say go right up to 10, but then I remembered Dodgeball.
That's awesome.
The Ocho.
Yeah.
Yeah. So let's do it now. Right after this thing, let's go out there. Sales the Ocho.
That's it. So we've got that. That new book will be coming out for you live in 2020. So stay tuned for more.
Right. And we're going to do things differently than the others. We're going to go straight to the 8th edition of Sales the Ocho.
That's awesome. It'll be endorsed by all of our friends. They'll tell you how great it is, and they'll never read the book.
Exactly. But they'll tweet about it.
They will. We'll see more tweets and retweets, but they will not read a lick of it. I would agree. That's funny. So you published your book a few years back. So tell us about what your book is about, because I think it is still relevant, Tibor.
I'm glad you think so. I'm not sure I think so, but I'm glad you think so. I think parts of it are relevant. Look, it's 2017. The book came out in 2010. I've got a couple of new cars since then. So, so I think what's changed is, the market's evolved. I mean, again, social selling, when we did the book, things like Twitter for sales and B2B sales was a relatively new thing. LinkedIn was just about to sort of get on its ascent and so on. And, so a lot of things that we take for granted now weren't there then. So I think, so I want to be clear. I don't think that the book is not relevant, and I would recommend that everybody who does B2B sales read about it. But there are things in the marketplace that have changed that have caused me to question how valid that is. And I keep threatening the planet with coming out with another book that sort of answers that question. And I have it written, I just need it edited. But I think what's changed for me a lot, and this was a question that kept coming up, not only from myself, but the person that we used to edit the book, is if you think about it, trigger events, right? There is this sort of notion that for a hunter is not that comfortable, which is, I have to wait for an event, a random event to get my sales success going. Doesn't sound very aggressive, doesn't sound very proactive, right? So I think knowing the buyer modes and some of the things that we talked about in terms of what you could do to leverage events that are bound to come up is great. But then you think of some of the examples, for instance, if a company gets financing and you read about it, and to show you how much things have changed in the book, we refer to it as, those tombstones you used to see in the Wall Street Journal or other business press when somebody did an underwriting or something. You know, how many of the current people, the millennials or the social sellers actually read those newspapers? But if I saw one of those tombstones, then, XYZ company just got $100 million in financing. Let's phone them and see what they plan to do with that money. And maybe some of that could be siphoned off to us, right? Maybe I should say that differently, but you know what I mean. Yep. So, but the reality is, in theory, everybody who reads the book and sees that same trigger will pounce into action. So how much advantage do I have? So for me, what was supposed to be in the second book that won't come from that people who produced the first one was the real action here is not the event. And I think that's the misleading aspect of the book. What we as salespeople capitalize on is the customer's reaction to the event. You'll have one reaction, another prospect will have a different reaction, and so on. What I capitalize on is the reaction to that event. So the question for the artist or for the salespeople becomes, how can I trigger that reaction without having to wait for the event? Because if I'm waiting for the event, I'm just one of 5 or 6 people at the bus stop waiting for the same bus going to the same place, right? So what advantage do I have at that point? Zip. So it doesn't matter how well I execute the craft, I don't get much of a lift. But if I can figure out how to get that customer to have the same reaction without having to wait for the event, and I'm the one in control of things as opposed to a random event, then I've got a leg up. And I think that's what's changed in my point of view. The fundamentals in the book, I think, are still there. I just, without sounding pompous, I think my thinking has evolved. And then there's a whole bunch of other things that come into it. I don't know if you've read the book, but for those people in the audience who have, the whole concept of window of dissatisfaction, well, if you do reading, and I did a lot of reading after the book, because one of the things I was trying to figure out is how can I take elements of loyalty and bring them in earlier in the cycle. So if I can touch those things that make you loyal to a company, maybe I can get you to buy from me. And what I found is that, for instance, satisfaction is a poor barometer for loyalty. So, everybody sends you, like 2 minutes after you hang up with GoDaddy for the simplest question, boom, there's a survey in your inbox, and what they're hoping for is you say satisfied and completely satisfied. But there's studies out there, numerous studies, and I can point people to specific ones that show that people who switch from one vendor to the next, so they'll go from Verizon to AT&T or whatever the case is, 75% of them said that they were satisfied or completely satisfied when they switched. So that means that I can get somebody to buy long before they're dissatisfied if I approach them the right way. So this notion of waiting around for them to go into the window of dissatisfaction, to me, yeah, you can take advantage of it if they do that on their own, but I'm not inclined to wait. I like to make things happen, and I think there's a lot of waiting in the book,
Yeah. No, I agree. I think, paying attention to the trigger events, I think is still really important. But like you said, I mean, yeah, the Wall Street Journal, as far as, those tombstones and yay, we just got funded. I mean, now we can do that with a Google alert. Now we can see that way faster than we ever could.
But it's not only faster. So one of the things, again, we talked about in the book, which is an important thing. So like what happens when there's, let's say in my example, I'm targeting VPs of sales. So Acme company just had a change in their VP of sales. That does lead to 3 opportunities. But the moment that the world finds out that Acme Corp just lost its VP of sales, everybody finds out at the same time. It's not like they telegraph me in advance. Hey, Tibor, the guy's going to leave in 2 weeks. We're going to fire him, right? That's not going to happen. So, I find out about it on Google the same day you find out about it on Google and so on. So, there are things in the book that talk about how you can position yourself, I think, quite well for predictable events. So we know an event is coming. We just don't know when, right? So for those things, yes. But, nobody's going to tell you any quicker than they tell me that they're about to fire their CFO. Because generally the guy who gets fired finds out first, right? So at that point, when that hits the wires, whether it's Google, Twitter, whatever, right? I don't think I find out any faster than the next person. And if it happens right now, as you and I are speaking, we're probably not going to find out about it till 20, 30 minutes from now. And some enterprising salesperson could have already booked an appointment.
So listening is maybe less important than messaging because
I think they
everybody
go
has the
hand in
same
hand.
agenda. Yeah. Okay.
And again, I think that, you know, salespeople, I think, need to look at the whole picture and then decide on a strategy and then get tactical about it. So, at any given time, I may decide that at this point I've got to deploy this, but with a different prospect, with different realities and so on, I might deploy a different approach, different set of tools and so on. But I think it is important that messaging and listening go hand in hand, and you need to know what to listen for, and that brings in a whole set of biases and so forth. So again, I go back to where we started. It's not one versus the other. It's how can I be most effective at what I do, and what I do is bring home the bacon.
There you go. Awesome. So, as we're kind of bringing this up to a close, Tibor, give us a couple of insights for folks if they're newer sales, right? We don't want to say younger because it isn't generational. We're talking experience level. So, newer salespeople, if they're looking to really kind of get their career jump started, give us a couple tips that you would recommend to those newer salespeople so they can do that.
So on a very practical level, and this is hard because of the social conditioning. So not social in the sense of social media and so on, but just general societal things, even if we took it back to the 60s, right? We're conditioned to be a social creature. We want to be part of the group. We don't want to be that one guy over there in the corner, right? Yet all salespeople buy into this notion of 80-20, right? 20% of your salespeople drive 80% of your revenue. 20% of your customers drive, and none of them have done the statistical analysis, but let's pretend, right? Yet, if you look at a new salesperson that comes into a company, whether they're 60 or whether they're 26, what do? They want to fit in, right? So they hang out with the crowd. The crowd is the 80% that's not producing, right? So they should be, going and hanging out with the guys that they're not seeing in the office. And what I find is that 20% that does drive the results, and again, you've seen the stats. SaaS salespeople, less than 20 of them make their numbers. 20% make their numbers. I think overall, based on CSO stuff, less than 60% of B2B make their numbers. So they should stop hanging around the office and looking cool and hanging out with the folks and leave the office with the guy who's never there. And what I find is those high performers are probably much more open to mentoring than other people because they're not worried about their success. They don't have the insecurities that other 80% has. So that would be rule number one, which is a very practical thing. So the first day, go into the office, look around, and all the people who are at their desk, smile and nod and ask where the guys who are not at their desk are and catch up with them and spend some time with them. The other, which is more on the sales side, is I think people, it goes back to our research question and so on. I think people spend way too much time talking about stuff that really doesn't matter. And what matters is the outcomes. So people that we're calling, especially people who don't know us, people who weren't on our website and downloaded all our wonderful content and stuff like that, and triggered a barrage of autoresponders and things along those lines, those people are focused on their business. And what they're looking at is how can I achieve my objectives? How can I get the impact that I'm looking for? And I think whether it's in prospecting or in sales calls or whatever, people spend too much time talking about how to get to the outcomes as opposed to leading with the outcomes. And if you can get them to lead, as a joke, I always say, give them the punchline first and then work your way back into the joke, as opposed to doing the whole joke and hopefully the customer stays awake through the process. And, at the end, you throw the punchline at them. So start at the end because that's what they're going to recognize. They really don't care if it's sales training by Tibor or if it's a piece of software. What they're trying to do is penetrate this new market, right? And if you can talk to them about how you've been able to help certain companies do things that this particular prospect is looking to do, and that's where this whole account-based marketing stuff can be of use, then start with the outcomes. Again, give them a happy ending and then work your way back. And I think most salespeople, because of the way they're trained by their company, spend a lot of time, talking about their product and this and this and this and that, instead of giving the customer what they want is, how are you going to help me get to the promised land? And if you can't get me there, I don't care how good looking you are. So, it's give them the outcome first and then work your way back, because it's the oldest thing in sale. What's in it for me? Give him that. Yet I hear thousands of calls because I get to listen in. And I'm so and so. I'm the Midwest manager for such and such a company, and we're a Fortune 500 company. That's a lot of wasted time and information that isn't relevant to the customer. They don't care. I'm sure your mother is very proud that you're now the Midwest manager for some company, but what is that going to do for me as I'm trying to get my product out the door competing with somebody else? So again, going back to what I said earlier, as a subject matter expert, you should be able to talk to the results and then convince them how you're going to get them there and why they should go with you.
I like that.
There's a making of a book there, right?
That's it. Huh? That's Sales de Ocho from Tibor Shanto.
Sales de Ocho. We're going to do that, Phil. I'm going to hold you to it. I'm putting a Twitter thing out as soon as we're done.
Awesome. Well, I've got the pictures to prove it in the recording. So, you'll be lead author, though. I'll just follow your lead, buddy.
There you go. We'll put the last chapter first.
That's right. Yep. We won't hide anything. We'll tell you all about the outcomes first, and then we're going to leave the office because we're going to be out hunting.
That's right. And you have to come and play dodgeball with us once a year.
That's it. Yep. If you can dodge a wrench, you can make a sale. That's pretty true.
There you go.
So very, very fun, Tibor. So last question for you, my friend. If people are going to go to, they're going to go to your website, of course. That's probably the best way to get some of your information at sellbetter.ca. But if you're looking for folks have questions, if they want to get connected with you, I know you're not going to wait for them to call you, but let's say that they want to. How would they best connect with you, Tibor?
So the easiest way is on the website. They can also take my first name dot last name at sellbetter.ca. But the easiest way is by phone, and they have two choices. Globally, +1 416-822-7781. For those of you in North America, or those of us in North America, toll free 1-855-25-SALES.
Awesome. 855-25-SALES. That's fantastic, Tibor. Well, thank you so much for spending some of your afternoon with us today. I learned a lot, and I certainly enjoyed chatting with you a bit. Thanks, buddy.
I had a great time. Thanks for inviting me on, and anytime I can help, let me know.
I sure will. Thank you.